Good.
Maybe about 15 years ago, driving Highway 65 down to Indianapolis. Anybody who's driven on Highway 65, if you're going 90 miles an hour, we're actually the slow car. Yeah. So, and I was driving this little Suzuki, and so like
Going live in 5 minutes.
Straight into it, it's like bam, 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 and it freaked me out because it's just very loud. But my car said the other one's fine. So I keep going, and I go maybe about 45 more minutes, and I find the truck stop. And I pull over, and then sure enough, the front and back bumper was ripped in half. Like, what happened? This is kind of silly. So what do I do? It's like, get a just duct tape it back up. I drive the rest of the way to Columbus. Duct tape car. That's one time. Yes. Okay. Howard the Duck. Oh, Peter Ray Bill. Oh my gosh. We did not take sorry. Yes. Oh, that would be he has a story. I think I would have a lot of cool bunch of shows. I thought maybe I wasn't talking about everyone that had it. You're right. There's like yeah, it'd be interesting to find out who they cast for. It's great that they got James Garner. That was so stupid that they fired him. It's the stupidest thing. It's like, James Garner got his screen.
done.
Could everybody take their seats and start? Very soon. You don't need to start talking.
That's the fastest all day, wasn't it?
This is your last one. You're gonna take all the time.
I don't even know what's on the phone, but
This is your last.
Phil looks really stoic with in this camera with the light, the way it's, yeah.
I'm gonna read from my phone.
That ruined.
I
Yeah.
don't normally like to introduce guests and speakers by reading their bio. It's something that normally I think that somebody that's introducing should sort of know. But our speaker for tonight has an extensive bio that I would like to read. Because I think it's important that we tonight here, that we know the extent of her experience, her education, her activism over the course of these many decades. So forgive me for reading directly from my phone, but I will do that to introduce Dr. Mary Ruwart. She is a recent, sorry, I gotta look over. I should be wearing bifocals too.
Hey, you want mine?
You just didn't expect it to be so.
I like my last speech as a former chair to flip all of you off. Can we research and get some better bifocals? You can do that for me in the next couple of minutes.
You want mine?
No, they make me sick. So let's cut this shit.
That's real professional.
Thank you.
That's real professional.
I don't get paid for this, so I'm not professional.
Thank God.
Au contraire. Yet it seems as if, through our discussions throughout the day, public and private, you're really interested in being involved in helping us correct some things that are going on in the park. Am I accurate in that regard? So Matt, start signing Bill for stuff up.
No, I already got a mark down for every committee chair.
Especially the audit.
Yeah.
Yes.
Dr. Mary Ruwart is a research scientist, ethicist, and a libertarian author and activist. She received her BS in biochemistry in, can I say what year it was? 1970. And her PhD in biophysics, you don't look like you did, unless you were like a child prodigy. That doesn't seem possible. And her PhD in biophysics in 1974, both from Michigan State University. She subsequently joined the Department of Surgery at St. Louis University and left her assistant professorship there to accept a position with the Upjohn Company of Kalamazoo, Michigan in 1976, which is your family's from right near there, right? So that made a ton of sense to it right there. See, I'm editorializing too. As a senior research scientist, Dr. Ruwart was involved in developing new therapies for a variety of diseases, including liver cirrhosis. Funny you should mention that in your bio as a libertarian. And AIDS. Here you go. Dr. Ruwart left Upjohn in 1995 to devote her time to consulting and writing. Her communications course for scientists, covering written, oral, and poster presentations, has received high praise from attendees. She also provides consulting services for nutraceutical companies, yeah, I pronounced that right, nutraceutical, clinical research organizations, and universities. Between 2003 and 2006, Dr. Ruwart was an adjunct associate professor of biology at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. During that time, she served with the Center for Applied and Professional Ethics, designing a medical research ethics course for the university. Her radical application of ethics to medical regulation, especially regulations regarding pharmaceuticals, has life and death implications. Since 1982, Dr. Ruwart has also been involved in societal ethics with a focus on the political theory and practice of libertarianism. Her award-winning international best-selling book, Healing Our World, copies are available, I think, on the table over there afterwards. So Bible, folks. They shall sign it for you, too. All right. Healing Our World demonstrates how the ethical application of libertarian principles has historically created harmony and abundance. Referencing hundreds of studies, Dr. Ruwart demonstrates that many of our current policies surreptitiously violate the basic ethical standards that we hold dear, thereby leading to unintended and highly undesirable consequences. Over the last 3 decades, Dr. Ruwart has often run for public office as a libertarian candidate, primarily to educate voters on the impact of ethical choices on their personal and financial well-being. Dr. Ruwart's sister, Marty, provided an extensive editorial critique to her first edition of Healing Our World in 1992. In 1993, Marty was diagnosed with terminal cancer and became one of Dr. Kevorkian's patients. In memory of her sister, Dr. Ruwart shares her story with those interested in the ethical issues surrounding assisted suicide in both public, such outlets as the Larry King Radio, Morton Downey Jr. Show, Rolanda, etc., and private forums, churches, schools, and hospice. Her internet column, Ask Dr. Ruwart, is a popular feature on the Advocates of Self-Government Liberator Online, Easy. Her book, Short Answers to the Tough Question, which I assume is also available, is based on these and other questions she has received over the years. Dr. Ruwart has worked extensively with the poor through her decades-long effort to rehabilitate low-income housing in the Kalamazoo area. She is also an active member of the Kalamazoo Rainforest Action Committee and has been profiled in American Men and Women of Science, Who's Who in Science and Technology, World's Who's Who of Women, International Leaders of Achievement, Who's Who of American Women, Community Leaders of North America, and several other prestigious biographical works. Currently, Dr. Ruwart serves as chair of Liberty International and secretary of the Foundation for a Free Society. She has been an at-large member of the Libertarian National Committee, served on the board of both the Heartland Institute, Michigan chapter, and the Fully Informed Jury Amendment Association, which is an organization that I actually belong to too. I would like you to give a warm welcome to Dr. Mary Ruwart.
I think I'm missing the laser pointer that, oh, there it is, okay. Just wanted to be sure that I had all my equipment before I got started.
You can handle the laptop? No, the slide.
Yes, I'm good. I'm good with this, I think. If it doesn't change, then I'll call you for assistance.
That was one-time offer,
Okay, well, tonight I'm going to talk to you about how to roll back big government without electing anyone. And I think this is an important topic for us because, well, you know, there's a considerable amount of bad news about trying to get elected. Obviously, we haven't achieved as many elected libertarians as we would like. And to really put this in perspective, I'm going to have to share with you, first of all, some bad news. But before I do, I want you to know good news is coming, so please don't get discouraged. And to do that, I'm going to talk about the wasted vote syndrome, which we all know is a factor in our not having as many elected libertarians as we want. But in 2008, at least I felt that we really saw how bad it was in a way we hadn't before. And that was because in Louisiana, Ron Paul was the only Liberty candidate on the ballot. The Libertarian Party wasn't on the ballot there for reasons I'm not totally clear on, but Ron Paul had done very well in the primaries in Louisiana. He was either first or second, depending on whose numbers you look at, and yet he only got 0.5% of the popular vote, which is about the same amount as he got when he was our 1988 Libertarian Party presidential candidate. So, and all the presidential candidate was getting. So that was very disappointing, and it appeared that maybe even dedicated liberty lovers, when they got to the polls, they would vote for the lesser of two evils. And when I was on the LNC, we actually did some surveys on this, and that's also what we found. A lot of libertarians were not voting libertarian when they got to the polls. So you can't really run in a major party either. And again, Ron Paul taught us this, because in 2012, when he had met the requirements for winning the number of primaries he needed to be considered for the presidential nomination of the GOP, they changed the rules after all the primaries were closed and upped that number. If I remember correctly, he needed 5 initially and they upped it to 8. And so he couldn't even be nominated. So if they're going to change the rules in the major parties when they see we're winning, so that's going to put an extra impediment in our way. And even the vote counting is suspect. I have personally seen campaigns where the candidates did not get the votes that they had been told by their friends and neighbors they got. When I was a campaign manager for a sheriff run in Kentucky, my candidate was told by several of his friends that they had voted absentee for him, but the total numbers were only one absentee vote for him. And if you want some more information about how difficult it is to really be sure a vote counting is accurate, I put a couple of references up there for you: Hacking Democracy and Black Box Voting, which has turned kind of into a book. So you can get these URLs and check it out, and it's kind of discouraging, actually. But maybe we shouldn't be too surprised, because as Joseph Stalin said, it's not the people who vote that count, it's the people who count the vote. And in fact, even if we do get somebody elected, for example, Ron Paul was an elected congressman, it's really hard sometimes to make an impact. Ron Paul has been very wonderful with me. He's written forwards for a couple of my books. I think very highly of him. But I think when you look at his congressional time, he wasn't able to pass a lot of libertarian measures. In fact, he was mostly a watchdog, and that's because the majority wasn't with him. And you do need a majority to get things passed in Congress. So you run up against that majority problem again. Now, that's not to say that libertarians aren't effective when they're elected. They are in many, many ways. But you can see that if we're going to have liberty, we really can't wait for a majority of libertarians to be elected. If we do, if we're going to wait that long, I'm afraid we'll have lost our liberty totally. So that's the bad news. Now for the good news. The good news is there are other ways to work the system. And to explain this to you, I'm going to talk about the very first run I ever did in the 1983 Kalamazoo City Commission race. In this race we ran as a slate. It was supposed to be nonpartisan, but since 4 people on our slate were declared libertarians and the media knew it, because we'd go to the city commission meetings and announce that we were libertarians, and the libertarian position on this particular issue was less than so. And because this was televised, so the entire city of Kalamazoo could listen to us, everybody knew we were libertarians. And the media felt that if they called us libertarians, that would discourage voters. Well, of course, by doing that, everybody had to ask us, what's a libertarian? Because back then they thought we were librarians or liberals. They didn't quite get it. And of course you can see this was a long time ago. It's in the cut and paste era. But actually we were really happy that they did that, because our intention in running was basically to tell people what libertarians stood for. So instead of waiting to kind of tell them, we got questions about it, and we talked about the philosophy, we talked about the non-aggression principle, we talked about taxation being theft, we talked about dissolving the IRS, legalizing drugs, all those things for which we really, at that point in time, had no good data showing how well that those reforms would work. Well, what was very interesting about that whole thing is that there were 4 or 5 slates running. The establishment slate, which was already elected, won, no surprise there. But we were second, so we were pretty proud of ourselves. And what we did is we had made such an impression on the rest of the city that when the biggest boondoggle ever in Kalamazoo was proposed by the city commission, a rail consolidation which would allow people in Kalamazoo not have to wait 5 minutes for the railroad, they were going to put the trains all over our streets instead. This was going to be the biggest boondoggle we had ever seen. It was going to cost the taxpayers more than they had ever paid before. And we as libertarians heard about the opposition to this, and we decided we would join them. So we went to a meeting, and someone came up to me, an elderly gentleman, and really before he even spoke to me, he put $200 cash in my hand. Now remember, this was 1983, with $200 could buy quite a bit more than it does now. And he said, Dr. Ruwart, I know your employer, Upjohn, is really for this rail consolidation. And that's because they're going to take the land that they need for it by eminent domain. And one of the things they're taking is my bicycle shop that my brother and I put together. But Dr. Ruwart, you are a libertarian. So I know that you are on my side. So take this money and fight for us, please. It took me years to realize the import of what was being said here. Because we had campaigned on principle, the voters felt they could trust us with their money, obviously. And we did join in the fight against rail consolidation, and we won. We rolled back big government and its proposed land grab without electing anyone. And we have lots of other instances of this in the libertarian movement today. I like to point to the Institute for Justice because it does such a good job. If you're not familiar with them, they are a group of libertarian litigators who take on cases usually involving the disadvantaged and many times people of color, and they win. They took eminent domain to the Supreme Court. And when that failed, when the Supreme Court ruled against them, they went state by state and tried to encourage that each state pass legislation to end eminent domain, or at least tone it down greatly. And if you're interested in this whole eminent domain thing, they've actually put out a movie recently called The Little Pink House, and this was their Supreme Court case. IJ has been so successful that when IJ gets involved in a suit, or even submits an amicus brief, the government backs off because they're afraid that IJ will come and really make them look like fools. So this is a great instance. But you know, we could imitate that state by state. I mean, think about this. Wouldn't it be wonderful if when the Wisconsin Libertarian Party got involved in some type of local issue, that the government backed off because it was so afraid of us? I sure like that image. But we have to work a little bit for that. But the reason we haven't really emphasized this is because we don't celebrate the many victories that the libertarians have had in this arena. And I'll list a few. I'm going to guess some of them in this room you haven't even heard of. You probably have heard of the one where LP member Steve Covey organized Prop 215 in California. This is the Medical Marijuana Act, the first one. And now you see it being repeated state by state. You see recreational marijuana being legalized. And the reason that's so exciting is that most of the drug war focuses not on hard drugs, but on pot. And that's because police would much rather arrest a pot smoker than somebody crazed on crack, because the pot smoker is less likely to shoot back. And that's why something like 50 to 60% of the federal arrests for drug use, for drug possession, are for pot, not for hard drugs. So the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is because once the war against marijuana is gone, the drug war is going to go down, because the biggest part of it will have been eviscerated. So this is actually a very big thing. And we should be celebrating all this and taking some credit for the fact that marijuana is being legalized, both as medical marijuana and as a recreational drug. It's very likely that we're going to end the drug war without electing anybody. Let's go to another case. Colorado, about the same time period. Colorado Libertarians were able to pass an initiative that meant that every time the state legislature wanted to hike taxes, they had to go directly to the voters. And they're really still angry about it. One of the LP members who helped pass this is still harassed by the local legislature because of this. And they were able to pass that without electing anybody. LP member Carol Ayn Rand actually helped, I guess I could say, to sabotage the Republican incumbent Bob Barr in his 2004 primary. How did she do it? Well, she was running for the same office, so even though she wasn't in the primary, she put an ad together that really made him look bad. And I'm going to try to paraphrase it because I don't think it's on YouTube anymore, so I'm going to have to do this from memory. But there was an elderly woman in a hospital bed, and she says, Bob Barr wants to take away my medicine, my marijuana, the only thing that helps me. Why do you want to do that, Bob? And that really made him look very bad, as you might imagine. We had a group of libertarians that actually were instrumental in defeating Clinton Care. And I know because I was part of that effort. And when I saw op-eds or papers that were fighting Clinton Care, what happened was I recognized the names. I knew these people, about 80% of them, and they were all libertarians. They were either in the party or in the movement. And we've never taken credit for defeating Clinton Care as libertarians. And we should, because another instance of rolling back big government without electing anyone. And when Obamacare came on the scene recently, the same arguments, the same papers that we have put forth as libertarians were now being used by the Republicans and other opposition to Obamacare. Unfortunately, we weren't able to keep that one at bay. More recently, the Goldwater Institute got the right to try passed. What this means is that terminally ill patients are now able to negotiate with drug companies if they want to be able to take a drug that has not yet been FDA approved. This was actually came from a suit that the cancer patients made. They sued the FDA for the right to take unapproved drugs. But the courts ruled that Americans have no right to save their lives if the FDA hasn't approved the drug that they want to take. So, we have had a lot of successes, and we don't really celebrate them enough. Back in the early days of the party, we rolled back big government without electing anyone quite a lot. We rolled back tax increases, regulations that were either local or, as I've said here, you can see some state ones, you can see some national ones. We were successful at that, but we didn't really celebrate it because in our culture, our libertarian culture, we got so focused on winning elections that we forgot that we could roll back big government without electing anyone. And when we do that, we really can become power players. Of course, I think we should go out and win whatever races we can. I'm not against that. I think it's a great thing. But that's not the only thing. When we are out there as candidates, our principles resonate with people. And the reason they do is that no one wants to have force, fraud, or theft initiated against them. And when we tell them that that's our basic principle, the non-aggression principle, they go, yeah, That's how I live too. And we do, one-to-one, we all do that. But group-to-group, not so much. And so that opens the door for you to be able to explain to them how we don't do it group-to-group, how when we interact through government, we're not embodying the principle that we find so successful when we interact one-on-one. And I liked the idea of being the people that, being the one that people turn to when Big Brother comes knocking, kind of like the Ghostbusters, you know, the political realm. And if we define winning as rolling back big government, whether or not we elect a Libertarian candidate and celebrate those victories, I think we'll have more of that. Our focus, I feel, in the party has become a little bit too narrow. And the irony of it is, when we roll back big government in our communities without electing anyone, we're more likely to get elected. Because people vote for their heroes and heroines. They vote for the people who help them. And had we run for city commission, again, 2 years from when this all happened, I'm pretty sure at least one of us would have gotten elected. Also, if you support coalitions that roll back big government, even if it's a single issue idea, these people that you're working side by side by are much more likely to be interested in your other libertarian views. So you have a natural audience to talk to. We can also support the nullification movement. I really believe that states are going to start wanting to nullify what the federal government is doing, because there's a lot of federal mandates that are being imposed on states, and the states have to pick up the bill. In fact, I actually had envisioned that if the federal government came down hard on medical marijuana, that might have been the issue on which the states would have rebelled and nullified. But I don't think that's going to be the issue. I think it might be healthcare. We'll talk about that in a minute. And of course, all of these things are very doable for us. We're actually really good at it because we're so organized as a party. We're so used to running candidates and getting that level of commitment and organization that when we go into a situation where we're trying to change local law, we're usually pretty good at it. So the other thing we have to do, of course, once we get people's attention, is show them how we can provide solutions to all kinds of things. And I'm just going to touch upon 3 tonight. First of all, healthcare crisis and deregulation. Everyone knows that healthcare is very expensive. What's not so easy to share with people is why. And the why, not surprisingly, is government regulation. The healthcare industry is probably one, if not the most regulated industry in the country. And tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the pharmaceutical industry, with I'm very familiar. So let's start by talking about what happened in 1962. And I'm not getting my pointer. All right, I'll do it without the pointer. So you can see in these little blue boxes that prior to 1962, it took about 4 years for a drug to get from the lab bench to the marketplace. In other words, what you're seeing here are the number of years it takes for a drug company to jump through the FDA regulatory hoops. After 1962, the FDA got a lot more power when the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drug Act were passed. And after that time, as you can see from the light green boxes, the time it took for a drug to get from the lab bench to the marketplace increased to 14 years. Now, when the AIDS crisis hit, the AIDS patients knew that they could not wait that long for a new drug. And so what they did, in violation of the law, the patent law and the FDA, is they hired black market chemists to make the very same drugs we were working on in the pharmaceutical industry. And by the time the FDA gave us permission to test our drugs in people, every AIDS patient in the country that wanted these drugs had already had them, and they were resistant. So we had to wait until new patients were diagnosed to do the FDA mandated studies. Now, you might have watched the Dallas Buyers Club, that award-winning movie that talked about just this situation. And what happened is the FDA did not prosecute the California buyers clubs because they had a lot of media attention and they looked really bad. It would have looked really bad for the FDA to go after them. Instead, it went after the individuals who did not have media attention. And that's what you saw in Dallas Buyers Club. Sick people being prosecuted by the FDA, even though what they were taking actually seemed to be extending their lives. Now, if you go from 4 to 14 years, you might imagine that the costs of developing a drug would go up. And you'd be right. In the squares, what you can see, the little white squares and the extrapolated line, I'm going to try again with our pointer. There it is. Well, it's not showing up very well. So, what's happening here is you can see from about 1950 to today, if pre-amendment trends had continued, the research and development per new chemical entity, or NCE, a very new drug, would have been probably below $200 million. But instead, as you can see with the dark squares, the cost of developing a drug is going up every year exponentially. And of course, being libertarians, you know that if a manufacturer has to pay extra costs to get a product on the market, they are going to have to charge more money. And that's exactly what happens. If you look at this slide, you can see that the capitalized research and development costs to get a new chemical entity on the market is highly correlated, or tracks with, if you want to think of it that way, the average cost of a branded prescription drug. So all of this hoopla about high drug prices isn't due to the middleman. It's not due to the greed of the pharmaceutical companies. It's due to the regulatory hoops that drugs are forced to go through. And you might think, well, it would be okay if drugs were safer with this extra 10 years, but in fact they aren't. Before the amendments were passed, the rate at which the FDA took approved drugs off the market was about 2.5%. After the amendment, it was 3.3%. It was greater, not less, like it was supposed to be. And of course, the biggest issues we've had pre-amendment were thalidomide, which caused 10,000 deformities in Europe. In the US, where it was not approved, because the FDA already had enough power to keep a drug off the market if they didn't like it for any reason, we had something between 17 and 40 infants that were born deformed because of thalidomide, because it was in testing in the US. But the FDA examiner was concerned about another side effect of thalidomide, which was peripheral nerve damage. So I don't know how many of you remember thalidomide, but it was a drug that if the woman took it in pregnancy, it deformed the unborn baby. And back then our science wasn't very good in terms of understanding how sensitive the fetus was to drugs that were perfectly safe for the mother.
Can you tell Brady why women took that?
Say again?
Can you tell Brady why women took that?
Yes. Well, women took that because even though this was supposed to be a safer sleeping drug initially, women found that it decreased their morning sickness. And so they started taking it, and the drug companies started advertising for that. And again, the lack of knowledge we had at that time about the effect of drugs on the unborn are what kept us from realizing it until it was too late for many children. So, after the amendments, we got the largest drug disaster in U.S. history, Vioxx. And in my book, Death by Regulation, I explained that there were some, Vioxx probably wouldn't have been approved except for these amendments. And by the FDA's own admission, it's caused 60,000 deaths or 140,000 heart attacks. And I think those numbers are a lot higher. This is the FDA's estimate. So why does an unsafe drug get to market in the first place? Well, as I explained with thalidomide, our knowledge just wasn't good enough, and that's true today. If it's known that the drug is going to cause major problems, it's unlikely to get marketed, or less likely to get marketed. However, our knowledge isn't perfect, and when you think about it, if you're withdrawing 2.5 to 3.5% after approval, that's actually, in my opinion, pretty small compared to the lack of knowledge we still have today. It's amazing that we haven't had more problems, in my opinion. But the bottom line on this then is these amendments don't give us more safety, but they do give us higher costs. And if pre-amendment trends had continued, we'd be paying about 10% of what we pay today at the pharmacy. But you know, it's not just a matter of money. Because people die waiting for these drugs, and because innovation is lost as companies take money they would have used for research and instead use it to jump through the regulatory hoops that the FDA demands, we probably each lost a minimum of 5 years of our lives. How can we tell? We've had so many studies done that you can actually make these estimates. But I think that number is twice that much, and the reason I think that is the amendments also made it very difficult to learn about prevention, especially of natural substances. And I can't put a real good number on that, but I suspect it's actually bigger than the 5 years. But conservatively, let's say it's another 5, so we've all lost 10 years of our lives. And this ripples out to other countries too, because what happens in the US affects other countries. So you can get kind of an idea of just how bad this is. I've only kind of scratched the surface because I could go on. But this is in my book, Death by Regulation, which just came out a year ago. You can get a lot more detail, although I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. So we've talked about healthcare, and really these same numbers likely apply to all kinds of healthcare regulation, like licensing of healthcare practitioners. The reason it's harder to calculate that is it's done state by state. So, you need to look at all 50 states to get a good number. I haven't done that yet. So let's talk about protecting the environment. One of the things that people are worried about are the rainforests. And if you look at the rainforests, they're actually populated by native people who take good care of the environment, but they're driven off because the government doesn't recognize their homesteading rights. And so if you actually saw the movie Medicine Man with Sean Connery, you actually saw this happen. He discovers a cure for cancer, but the government has taken a payoff from a corporation who wants to clear cut the forest, and so the cure for cancer is lost. And that's probably happening in real life. Now, this business about governments not recognizing homesteading rights is very prevalent. In fact, in most third world countries, 70% or so of the land does not have free and clear title as we understand it. And Liberty International, I'm currently chair of the organization, but really this is a whole board effort. We have a member who is trying to change that. It's called the India Property Rights Project, and what happens is we help them raise money for GPS units. A farming community can go ahead and map out what they consider their common law boundaries. Because until they get formal title, the government can drive them off their land anytime. and does. So they measure all their boundaries, and if they have disputes, they settle them so that they can, as a community, go and register the property and get that free and clear title. Overnight, the property value goes way up. And this allows them to mortgage the property if they need to for starting a business. They can build a house without worrying they're going to be driven on, away from it. And it's really a wonderful thing because now people who did not have property and land overnight have it. The poor of the world are sitting on a gold mine that they cannot use. So we're trying to help them do that. And here in the US, Oliver Porter, who we've had to many of our national conferences, or international conferences, has talked about how he privatized the city of Sandy Springs in Georgia. Everything but police and fire. And that has been so successful that he goes around the world consulting with governments and of all kinds, including state governments and local governments, of how to do that. I put it up here because I thought maybe some of you might be interested in that. And of course, in terms of endangered species, hunting bans don't work because the people who live in the area where the elephants are, they don't like the fact that they can't sell the elephant parts. And the elephants come and they trample the crops and they trample the people. And so they're not very fond of elephants, even though we in the US might be. So these bans really kind of backfire. In fact, in Kenya, as you can see, from 1979 to 1979 to 1998, their elephant population went from 65,000 to 19,000 because the bans just didn't work. The native people didn't pay much attention to them. But Zimbabwe did something different. It gave the people in the communities where the elephants live property rights of the elephants. It said, okay, they weren't full property rights, but the natives were allowed to sell certain parts of the elephant. So all of a sudden, the elephant became a valuable source of income. And what they did is they wanted to make sure that their valuable source of income continued. So instead of killing the elephants, they protected them. And in the same period that Kenya's elephant herds dropped precipitously, Zimbabwe's actually increased from 30,000 to 43,000. And these privatization efforts, kind of domesticating or somehow allowing people to make use of the animal, has brought back a number of species. I listed a few here at the bottom of that slide, and there's many more. In fact, on this slide, I've actually listed the private companies or individuals who really brought back a number of species from extinction by either breeding them for hunting purposes or for zoos or whatever. So it's been very successful. But there are some species that are very hard to domesticate. And I like this story a lot because I'm partial to cats. And here in this beautiful picture, you see a snow leopard. They can't quite be domesticated, and there's not enough of them really to even think about selling the fur, for example, or the hide. So what the Seattle-based Snow Leopard Trust did is they went and they talked to the people in Mongolia and other areas where the snow leopard is. And what they found out is the farmers hated the snow leopards because they hunt their goats, for example. And, these people are poor enough that one goat can make the difference, really, between having a well-fed family and having one that's barely getting by. So what this group in Seattle did was they collected donations so that they were able to provide the farmers with fencing that was snow leopard resistant. They helped the farmers to redevelop the areas where the ibex roamed. The ibex is a horned goat, which is the natural prey of the snow leopard. And that was so successful that they then started selling hunting permits for the ibex at $5,000 apiece. That's a lot of money to one of these little villages. They also have an insurance program where if the farmers agree not to kill the snow leopards, that if one of them does get their goats, they can be reimbursed, and several other things. It's a wonderful site to go to. I put their website up there. You can see wonderful pictures of the snow leopards and even some baby ones. Very cute. So we talked about healthcare. We talked about protecting the environment. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between government spending, jobs, wealth creation, and the poor, because that's a big subject. We as libertarians always get that question, wouldn't the poor starve in a libertarian society? And I always like to say just the opposite, because government is the creator of most poverty in the world today. And then you can have a conversation of why that's so. Well, no one here is going to be surprised. I'm going to skip that one. No one here is going to be surprised that regulations actually destroy private sector jobs. And here you can see, in the dark line, you can see that there was a time when federal regulators actually decreased during the Reagan years. They were fired or retired and not replaced. And after that, they were retired. And in the meantime, private sector jobs rose when the regulators were put out of business and fell when the regulators were rehired. So if you look at the calculation, about one regulator destroys about 160 private sector jobs a year. So if you want more jobs, it's quite easy. You just fire the regulators. Yeah. And as you can see from my earlier slides, regulators don't necessarily protect us. In fact, I could go on about all the studies that have been done that show just the opposite. So let's look at government spending. This is a graph with, I think, 120 countries of the world. And what it shows is, on the bottom axis, you see that countries that spend about, where the government spends about 60% or more of the GDP, there isn't much wealth creation going on. But if they spend less than 25% or so, they have a lot greater wealth creation. And it doesn't matter what the government spends it on, because even when they're spending it on good things, they do a very inefficient job of it. Like education, for example. We know how inefficient that is. But the good news is any country can turn this around very quickly. And you can see this because Ireland, Great Britain, and
New Zealand.
thank you, my mind blanked out, thank you. New Zealand, all at different times of their at different times during their development, found out that if they got rid of tariffs, lowered taxes, and eased up on their regulations, that they could convert their country from one that had a very low level of wealth creation to one that had a very high level of wealth creation. And this happened very quickly, really in a matter of a year or two. It didn't take long. And if you think about this for a moment, that means that libertarians, if they were able to achieve this kind of a change in government, would end up making the U.S. a much more productive country. In fact, it would be so productive, it might be possible to retire our debt. I mention this because no other party has a really good plan for retiring the debt. They want you to pay more taxes, but when you pay more taxes, that means that you will actually get less wealth creation. So that doesn't really work. But libertarians might have a solution to the debt crisis. I talk more about all of these things in my other two books, Healing Our World, The Compassion of Libertarianism, and Short Answers to the Tough Questions. but I'm going to mention my website, ruwart.com, because I have a lot of free items on there in my free library. So if you go there and sign up for my newsletter, you'll get a free pass to the library, and you can look at a lot of this type of stuff without actually having to buy the book. In fact, Healing Our World, the 1993 edition, is free in the free library. This is the 2015 edition you're seeing here, and it is available for sale today. So, I don't want to wait for liberty. I know you don't either. So my suggestion is while we are trying to win elections, in the meantime, let's roll back big government without electing anyone. We can do it right now. So run as an LP candidate, and I suggest you really talk about our principles because they're very appealing to people. It hits them in the gut that this is something they like. They may not understand it. They may react to say taxation is theft, but they like the idea that everyone can govern themselves as long as they don't initiate force, fraud, or theft against others. They resonate that at a gut level, and I know that because for 10 years I went into the classrooms at Kalamazoo. I probably did 10 a year, and I always asked people, before I even started my talk, all the students, I said, let's take a vote. You tell me what government you want. Do you want the minority to rule the majority? Do you want the majority to rule the minority? Or do you want everyone to rule themselves as long as they don't initiate physical force, fraud, or theft against others? 90 to 100% of the class, every class, raised their hand for the libertarian principle. And when I asked them, what do you think that the US government uses as their yardstick? I got one student in all those years raising their hand for the libertarian ethic. And this is before they even know it's the libertarian ethic. It hits them at their gut. And that's what Robin was talking about today. And that's what we have to do. And of course, I'd like to see us be the go-to people when big government comes knocking on people's door. And, IJ has done a really good job of that. I think our local parties could too. So I encourage you to support referendums, propositions, whatever your community allows at the state and local level to roll back big government and provide free market solutions. I know you can do that. The only reason I talked about those three today is I felt those were things that sometimes even libertarians aren't familiar with, the environment, healthcare, because we really don't have a lot of training in that. The nice thing about doing something like this is you can roll back big government any time of the year. You don't have to wait for an election. I like that part. And of course, we should elect a few healthy members as we do this. And if we roll back big government without electing anyone, I can almost guarantee that we will elect a lot more libertarians. Thank you. Time, I'm happy to take questions.
You have time, all time.
Okay, would you be so kind as to
Want people to moderate them?
let the,
Suppose.
is there a microphone we can pass around?
We need to turn the lights on a little bit higher too, maybe.
I think if you can't hear him,
Okay, fine.
Dave.
Yeah. So the other day, I was listening to an interview with an economist from the Brookings Institute, and he was making the case that an absolute zero deficit was not a good thing, essentially based on the way our credit system works and taking out, being able to borrow money to fund wars like World War II or something for a legitimate cause, whatever.
No one's a good one.
Whatever.
Oh,
Anyways.
is that not?
I had a hard time wrapping my head around how a zero deficit or a surplus would be a bad thing.
Let's finance
Can you
those
shed
wars
some
with
light on
cash.
this at all?
You guys, she needs to hear the question.
I mean, can you shed some light on this or try to rationalize the thinking for me?
I'm sorry, but I just, you can always use an analogy between an individual and the government. So if we kept borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, you know what happens when your credit card debt goes up. Not good. And I mean, I've heard this story before. I can't do the math on it. I've had a lot of math experience. So I really don't think that argument really is a true argument. I think it's the same argument that one might make why it's good to inflate the currency. I mean, people make that argument too, and it's not a good one.
Thank you.
Your gut is telling you the right thing.
Matt?
I guess you talk about the rates of, usually graph the rates of prices going up because of regulations. I guess I'm curious, the amount of subsidization that's going into the pharmaceutical industry that might, does that make the problem worse, I guess?
Well, the way the pharmaceutical industry is subsidized is not directly, but it's indirect, because what happens is the government collects a lot of taxation in order to fund what they call basic research. But it's inefficiently used. And so it's not, a lot of people say, well, some of these discoveries were made in universities. But even when that was happening, right after the 62 amendments, there still wasn't much going on from the universities because universities were not allowed at that time to patent their discoveries. And once you have that much regulation, the only way that there's any hope of a drug company recovering their R&D is to have patent exclusivity. And yet only 3 out of 10 approved drugs make up that. The whole industry now is based on blockbuster drugs, which is really dangerous. And that's why they're consolidating, because the small companies, of course, can't afford to take a hit if the FDA won't approve their drug. So a lot of people argue that the drug companies are subsidized with all this, quote, basic research, but now universities can patent that research, and then the pharmaceutical companies has to license that patent. So that argument is no longer, in my opinion, a very strong one.
Paul, did you have one?
Yeah, I appreciate letting me say this. This is strictly FYI. You had mentioned the thalidomide situation in that, and PBS, they had this drama called The Midwife, which took place in Britain in the 50s and 60s. Midwives delivering babies and that. And a few seasons back, they covered the thalidomide situation where, as you said, the babies were becoming deformed and such. And in Canada, they still kept the drug on the shelves long after all the other countries got rid of them and that. So anyway, the reason that there were so few here in the States is that I can't remember the woman's name, but she worked for the Food and Drug Administration.
Kelsey.
And she worked long and hard to make sure that stuff never came back. And because of that, President Kennedy gave her the Medal of Freedom for that.
That's right, and of course she did the right thing for the wrong reason. She was focused on the problems, the side effects on the nervous system, not on the deformities of the babies, because nobody was aware of that. With this 9-month lag, it took a while to figure it out. So basically the FDA did have that power. In some countries, did take their time taking it off the shelves, which, again, shows you government doesn't always protect you.
But again, just an FYI. Thanks for letting me relate that.
Hank?
So a talking point that I hear a lot is that Trump has rolled back regulations. I own a vape shop, and that has not been my experience, particularly in regards to the FDA. So my question is there any light at the end of the tunnel, or are they getting worse? Are they getting better? What's your kind of opinion on the FDA, how we get out of that over-regulatory situation?
Yes,
And
okay.
Are they at the worst they've ever been right now, or are you seeing it getting better?
Well, I think they're at the worst they've ever been, and the reason is that these 1962 regulations were open-ended. they allowed the FDA to keep adding more and more and more, and the drug companies dare not object because the FDA can punish them by dragging their feet on their approvals. If I were working for a drug company today, I could not give this talk. And now, is it getting better? Yes, I'm glad you asked that because, you know, libertarians have a great opportunity here. A lot of people hate the FDA, the people in prevention, the people who take supplements. In fact, the first people who actually won a court case, a major court case against the FDA, were two libertarians who founded the Life Extension Foundation. The FDA came after them for putting coenzyme Q on the market here in the US. Japan had it, but it was considered a prescription drug, so the FDA said that they were marketing unapproved drugs. Their lawyer told them, better give in and serve some time because you cannot beat the FDA. And they said, no way. It took them 6 years to get all the, I can't remember how many, something like 24 charges dropped. But they went to the media, and time, of course, helped them because more and more studies became available showing that coenzyme Q was very important. It's something your body makes. And people who take statins now should be taking coenzyme Q, and most doctors prescribe it along with it because coenzyme Q helps counter the side effects of the statins. So we would have been denied this very important natural product had not a couple of libertarians stood up and fought the system. Now, right to try is essentially another go-around of this. There's a problem with right to try, and the problem is that the drug companies, the drug that the drug companies and the patients are negotiating with has to stay in the FDA approval track. And if the FDA gets upset with the drug company for giving that drug and going around them, they can punish that drug company. So not too many drug companies are willing to take that risk. However, on the horizon, there is another libertarian initiative. And this is the Heartland's Free to Choose initiative. They actually asked my opinion on this, and I told them, you know, if you keep this Achilles heel that Right to Try has, you're going to have the same problem. And so they changed it, and they are now proposing 2 tracks. Basically, the drugs just have to get through the first phase of the FDA testing, and then they go into an entirely different track, and they can be there forever and never get FDA approval, and they can be sold. This is something I hope if you hear about it that you'll support, because I think this actually might change the whole way the FDA works. It's essentially a private track. And the reason that Bart Madden proposed it was that he felt if you had these 2 tracks, you could compare them. And of course, he believed the FDA would be found wanting. But once again, libertarians can make a big difference here. There's a whole huge population of people who hate the FDA out there because it is preventing them from getting nutritional supplements and getting information about these supplements. And that's why, and I could go into stories about that, but unless somebody asks me to, I won't, because I want to have lots of questions. But we could go after those people. And that was my plan. If I had gotten the 2008 nomination for president, I would have gone after those people because they are so understanding about this one issue with the FDA that I think they would quickly learn, or if they don't know already, and be open to the rest of our philosophy. And there are a lot of people out there, a lot.
Right. Kind of partially answered this question, but are there any other organizations out there other than us that is leading the charge against the FDA and rolling back the FDA's powers?
Well, you know, the Life Extension Foundation still is. It can get away with more than most supplement makers simply because the FDA doesn't want to take them on again. So they do a lot of work on that. But the important thing is that nobody understands how regulations are behind the high drug prices. And this is an unsustainable model. Trump had a big effort to lower drug prices. He promised he would, but because he didn't understand the reason behind the drug prices, he couldn't do it. And really, libertarians are the only ones who really get that. And so that's where we could really make our mark. As I said earlier, I think we could have a big impact because healthcare may be the pivotal freedom issue. It's very possible because it affects everyone, including Congress, including the FDA examiners. You know, it's not just us that's losing 5 to 10 years of our lives. It's the President of the United States. It's everybody who's making these laws. If we could get that word out, I think things could change.
Yeah, I was wondering if, in your opinion, whether or not you thought just outright disobeying laws and defending ourselves against the state's enforcers is a effective and ethical way of pulling back big government.
Yes, actually it can be very effective. I mean, the AIDS patients did it, and as I mentioned, and frankly, there's a lot of other patients doing it too. There are ALS patients making the drugs that are in clinical testing in their kitchen. In their kitchen. I wouldn't even attempt that. I mean, you just don't have the right equipment. So, again, the fact that people are doing this in the healthcare, in healthcare where they really need something, is something that is going to continue to happen, with or without our help, because people are so desperate. So yes, I mean, the AIDS patients actually made a pretty big dent in the system by what they did. And I think most people don't even know about that history, other than what they saw in the Dallas Buyers Club.
Any other questions? Oh, Shania.
So I just recently learned that the FDA approved a drug that was stronger than fentanyl, and fentanyl itself is actually deadly. So I was wondering if they're for our protection, why would they approve such a drug that's already killing?
Excellent question, and I actually have an answer for that. So one of the things, you saw that timeline that I showed, how drugs were taking 14 years to get to market. Well, and you saw how much they cost and everything, and the FDA said, well, you know, we're having trouble getting our examiners to look at everything. We just can't go that fast. So if the drug companies will pay us a user fee, we will be able to hire more examiners. So in 1992, they passed what they call the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. Then it was $100,000. Now it is over $2 million. Half of the FDA examiners who decide, you know, what drugs get approved, well, and that's a conservative estimate, it might be as high as 70%, are paid by these user fees. So, one of the reasons Vioxx got approved was that there was an FDA examiner who said, hey, this thing's dangerous, we shouldn't approve it. And he went to his supervisor said, the drug companies are our client. Of course we're going to approve it. And that's what's happening. You see, from the FDA's standpoint, if they don't continue to approve drugs, then they don't, you know, they aren't going to get user fees, because what's going to happen is the industry is going to crumble if they don't approve drugs, and their payments are going to be lower. So now, in any other situation, in any other company, there would be fingers pointed saying, conflict of interest. But it's government. But now, we as libertarians, we are good ethicists. That's one thing we are. I know we used to talk in terms of morality. Don't talk about morality, talk about ethics. That's the buzzword today. And actually, you still do not need like a degree in ethics to be an ethicist. And one of the problems I have with modern day ethicists, and I'm possibly going to write a book about this, is that they don't ask, I mean, what they do is they ask, how much regulation do we need? They don't ask, should we have any regulation at all? But we do. But we do. And so if you are able, and if you want more information, just contact me. But if you are able to get involved in the ethics practice in some way, you know, you can, you in this room are probably more ethical and more educated, I should say, in ethics than most of the people that call themselves that.
This payment of user fees, does that not open up an avenue of criminal negligence for employees of the FDA that didn't exist before?
Very possibly. I mean, no one's sued, but we could.
The reason I asked was I would like to find out more about that because the post office lost $2,000 worth of books of mine that I was shipping between two addresses. And I discovered that by law I didn't have a right I didn't have a claim against them because they were the post office, there was a special carve out. And I'm wondering if such a thing would have been included in the legislation that enabled these user fees.
No, but you know, remember, government has sovereign immunity. You know, yeah. So for example, another little environmental fact that you might not be aware of is that the U.S. military is the world's greatest polluter. Depending on whose numbers you look at, it pollutes more than 2 to 5 of the top chemical companies. It has actually been, cases have been won against it in the atomic testing that happened in Utah. And the judge said, yes, they're guilty, but victims don't get anything because the government has sovereign immunity. And the way that works is sometimes the government does allow itself to be sued. Sometimes they do make some payments. But in the big things that we're talking about, no. And again, that's an issue that libertarians could take on.
Yeah. Why do people sue the government then? If they know that they can just say, we're done anyway.
Well, I think that there's a, because there have been some cases where they've paid, I think maybe, and because attorneys like to sue because they make money, might be. Or what? Principle, yes. Actually, a lot of people have sued the FDA. The courts have ruled against the FDA many times. The FDA just has done nothing. They've been brought back to court. The judge has reprimanded them very strongly, in very strong language. I think I put it in death by regulation. Hasn't changed anything because they have our tax dollars. So they can go into court as many times as they want, and they do. They keep going in until they get the ruling that they want.
And sometimes there's a political calculation. So for example, when there's police violence, sometimes the victims sue the police and there's a settlement, and that looks good. And of course, they're paying the settlement with taxpayer money, so nobody's. So that's kind of how people navigate that, or use the government navigate that. Thank you.
I was like, does that make it kind of interesting too for the vaccine court? I mean, like, oh, well, you can't sue us and you can't do this, so that's why we created this little private court system.
Well, actually, the reason they can, okay, so what happened when these regulations were passed is drugs that had a one-time use started to be very unprofitable. And that fell into the vaccine camp. And then the FDA compounded that by picking a time, a few years where they were very, very hard on the vaccine manufacturers. You know, we had a situation, for example, in North Carolina where one vaccine company sold its procedures and everything to a different company, but because the FDA hadn't finished its inspection of the new company, they actually let our military go overseas without vaccines because it was the only company that were making the ones they needed. And so what ended up happening is it got down to 2 vaccine companies. And then to resurrect vaccines, the government said, well, okay, we know that vaccines are a biological product, like all drugs. They have side effects, and biological products have more than chemicals, for example, normally. So we will assume the liability in this vaccine court, and you manufacturers, you won't have to worry about it. So now all of a sudden, the vaccine manufacturers are in good shape because they don't have to worry about liability of a biological product, which normally would have a lot of liability. So that's the story on that. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to take questions after this, and I'll stay as long as need be. If you ever need to get a hold of me because you think of other questions, you can get at me through my website, Ruwart. Thank you.
Right over here, you're going right over there, Dr. Ruwart, to sell books?
Oh, yes,
All right, that's good. Announcements before we adjourn for the night, which I think is where we're at, right? The new XCOM will be meeting tomorrow morning at?
9:30.
Where's the chair?
I'm right here.
What time is the XCOM tomorrow?
Set the meeting, Mr. Chairman.
9:30?
5:30?
Yeah. 9:30. 9:35.
Where? 9:30 in this room. Okay, so, and just a reminder, 10 a.m.
Wait, when's the coffee?
It's my first day.
You are having this.
Hey,
We need to revisit these elections.
this is your fault.
That's not my fault. That's the question.
It's your fault for resigning.
I didn't resign. Here. What are you broken for? So 10 o'clock tomorrow morning here, and just a reminder, per our Constitution and bylaws, all XCOMs are open to all members of the Libertarian Party of Wisconsin. You just can't vote, you can attend, you may not be able to speak, depending on the wishes of the chair, whoever that might be. But that is, so you're all welcome, I guess is what I'm saying. It's the XCOM, everyone who's here is welcome.
Guys, come tomorrow, obviously, but we'll be selecting committees. So if you're interested in either being a member of a committee or chair of a committee, we'll be doing that tomorrow. So.
But you don't have to volunteer to apply tomorrow, those committees are always.
No, I'm just saying, like, it'd be a lot easier.
But if you're interested,
face.
that would be the time to get off, get the ground running. Any other questions for Nate or for Matt? Because I have no authority whatsoever to be standing here.
Thank you for your service.
No, you're not. I told you I did it for my own reason.
You better officially hand the gavel over now.
I'm trying. Anyway,
Remember that.
are there any other announcements, Nate? No other announcements? All right, good night, everyone.
Anybody wants a shot?
Points out. You mentioned IJ, the government's back off and they get involved, and sometimes that's true. Have you heard of the Foxconn boondoggle that's going on in this country? Foxconn is the manufacturer of the screens for the big international company. They can use the legislatures that we ought to have quote-unquote incentives to get them to create 15,000 based somewhat on performance. Another part of the law was simply Village of Mount Pleasant, which is southern side. They're going to put $941 million infrastructure, use of eminent domain of the sea's land. So I guess you're interested in meeting. The state will pay 40% of that ride. I consider and they have circled. Bullshit. When the tax bill